Picture the banks of the Indus River around 2600 before the Common Era. Across the floodplains stretches a civilization of breathtaking order. Not one but dozens of cities rise with identical precision, streets laid in perfect grids, buildings constructed from standardized bricks cut in the exact ratio of 4 to 2 to 1. Underground, sophisticated drainage systems carry waste away from homes. Public baths suggest communal gathering spaces. Yet as archaeologists have carefully excavated these sites over more than a century, they encounter something profoundly unusual in the ancient world. There are no palaces, no royal tombs filled with gold and tributes to departed kings, no temples dominating the skyline with priestly authority, no weapons of conquest scattered across the landscape. The art contains no images of rulers, no depictions of gods demanding worship, no records of military glory carved into stone. Instead, the Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called Harappan culture, appears to have organized itself without the hierarchies that defined every other ancient society. For 700 years, millions of people lived in these carefully planned cities, trading goods from Mesopotamia to Afghanistan, maintaining their undeciphered script on thousands of seals. Then, gradually and mysteriously, they abandoned their cities. The civilization that built without kings simply faded from history, leaving behind one of archaeology's most profound questions. How did an entire advanced society organize itself without rulers, and where did they go? In the depths of prehistory, along the floodplains of the Indus River, something extraordinary was taking shape. Around 6,000 years before the present day, in the regions we now call Pakistan and northwest India, the seeds of one of humanity's great civilizations were being sown. This was not a civilization that would announce itself through towering monuments or the glorified deeds of kings carved into stone. Instead, it would emerge quietly, methodically, with a precision that suggests something far more remarkable than the whims of individual rulers or the ambitions of priestly castes. This was the birth of the Indus Valley civilization, a world of order, uniformity, and purpose that would puzzle scholars for centuries to come. The geography of this region shaped everything. The Indus River itself was both blessing and burden, a waterway that brought life through annual floods, spreading fertile silt across the plains and making agriculture possible in what would otherwise be a semi-arid landscape. The terrain varied considerably across the civilization's span. To the west lay the Hindu Kush Mountains and the highlands of Afghanistan. To the east stretched the Thar Desert. The river valleys and floodplains formed a corridor of habitability, and it was within this corridor that communities began to flourish. The climate during this early period was warmer and semi-arid, with monsoon rains that followed seasonal patterns. These rains were not constant or guaranteed, but when they came, they sustained the crops that fed growing populations. Sediment cores recovered by modern researchers reveal that during the civilization's peak, this climate regime remained relatively stable, providing the environmental consistency that allowed complex societies to develop and flourish. This stability was crucial. Civilizations require predictability. They require the confidence that next season's harvest will come, that the river will flood at the expected time, that the patterns established by generations past will continue into the future. Long before cities rose, there were farmers. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 7,000 years before the Common Era, agricultural settlements had begun to take root in this region. People cultivated wheat and barley, domesticated cattle and sheep, and created the surplus that allows civilization to exist. Without surplus, there can be no cities, no artisans, no merchants, no priests. There can only be the endless cycle of subsistence. But in the Indus Valley, the land was generous enough to allow communities to produce more than they needed to survive. Over millennia, these farming communities grew larger and more sophisticated. By around 3,500 years before the Common Era, settlements were becoming more complex. Pottery styles were developing. Trade networks were beginning to form. People were no longer simply farming in isolation, but beginning to exchange goods with neighboring communities. This was the Harappan period in its early phases, named after the site of Harappa, one of the great cities that would eventually emerge. The people of these early settlements left behind pottery, stone tools, and the first hints of the organization that would characterize their civilization. Then came the transformation. Between 2600 and 2300 years before the Common Era, something remarkable occurred. The scattered agricultural settlements unified into a coherent civilization of unprecedented scale and sophistication. Historians call this the mature Harappan phase, a designation that captures the sudden appearance of standardization and organization across a vast territory. What had been local and diverse became coordinated and uniform. This was not a conquest. There is no archaeological evidence of warfare or invasion. Instead, it appears that communities adopted common standards, aligned their practices, and created a shared culture that stretched across the entire Indus Valley. The most striking evidence of this transformation appears in the physical remains of the cities themselves. Excavations at sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reveal cities laid out according to principles that seem almost alien in their precision. The streets run in perfect grids, oriented to the cardinal directions. The buildings are constructed of standardized bricks, each one adhering to the same proportions. The ratio of these bricks was 4 to 2 to 1, a mathematical relationship that appears consistently across the civilization. This was not accident or coincidence. This was planning. This was design. This was intention. The cities themselves were engineering marvels. Mohenjo-daro, one of the largest, covered an area of more than 5 square kilometers and housed a population that scholars estimate at between 35,000 and 40,000 people. Harappa was similar in scale and sophistication. But there were dozens of these cities, not just 2. Across the Indus Valley, from the highlands of Baluchistan to the Gujarat coast, settlements followed the same architectural principles. Streets were broad and carefully organized. Drainage systems ran beneath the streets, carrying away wastewater and sewage with a sophistication that would not be matched in many parts of the world for thousands of years. In Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists found evidence of public baths, including the famous Great Bath, a rectangular pool surrounded by chambers and stairs, suggesting community gathering spaces and possibly ritual practices. The uniformity extended to weights and measures. Traders throughout the Indus Valley used the same standardized weights for commerce. Pottery vessels were made to consistent sizes. This suggests some form of centralized authority, some mechanism by which standards were established and maintained across vast distances. Yet here is where the puzzle deepens. For despite this obvious organization and coordination, there is no evidence of kings. No palaces have been found. No monumental art celebrating rulers. No royal tombs filled with treasures and the bodies of subordinates sacrificed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the palaces of the Minoans, all these speak of centralized power and individual rulers. The Indus Valley left no such monuments. Instead, what emerges from the archaeological record is a civilization organized around principles we struggle to understand. The absence of evidence for monarchy or priesthood suggests something different, something that does not fit easily into the categories we use to describe other ancient civilizations. Some scholars propose that cities were governed by merchant councils or assemblies of elites. Others suggest that the standardization itself was a form of social technology, a shared commitment to order that did not require a king to enforce it. The truth remains elusive, buried beneath 5,000 years of time. The people of the Indus Valley were traders and craftspeople. Seals carved from stone, each one bearing animal motifs and inscriptions in the still undeciphered Indus script, have been found throughout the region and beyond. These seals likely served as marks of ownership and authentication, tools of commerce and bureaucracy. They are small objects, often no larger than a thumbnail, yet they speak volumes about the sophistication of Indus society. The animals depicted include bulls, tigers, rhinoceroses, and elephants, creatures that inhabited the landscape and held significance in the culture. The script itself consists of approximately 400 unique signs. Despite more than a century of scholarly effort, despite computer analysis and comparative studies, the script remains a mystery. Some researchers believe it encodes a language. Others argue it may be primarily symbolic. Without a bilingual inscription, without a Rosetta Stone that could unlock its meaning, the voices of the Indus Valley remain silent. Beads were produced in extraordinary quantities. Carnelian, lapis lazuli, shells, and other materials were fashioned into intricate forms. These beads were not simple ornaments, but products of specialized craft knowledge. Some were drilled with precision that required sophisticated tools. The production of beads appears to have been a major industry, with evidence suggesting that workshops produced them in quantity for trade. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, indicating that Indus craftspeople had access to distant materials and participated in long-distance trade networks. Indeed, the reach of Indus commerce was extraordinary. Seals bearing the Indus script and characteristic iconography have been found in Mesopotamia, in the cities of the Sumerians and Akkadians. Mesopotamian records mention trade with a place called Meluha, which scholars generally identify as the Indus Valley. These records speak of merchants and goods flowing between civilizations. The Indus Valley exported goods that the Mesopotamians valued. What exactly those goods were remains somewhat unclear, but evidence suggests textiles, beads, and perhaps spices and timber. In return, Mesopotamian goods found their way to the Indus Valley. This trade was not a one-way relationship, but a genuine exchange, a connection between two great civilizations of the ancient world. The docks at Lothal, a coastal settlement in Gujarat, provide physical evidence of this maritime trade. Lothal featured a carefully constructed harbor basin with channels connecting to the sea and structures that appear to be warehouses for storing goods. Here, merchants would have loaded their vessels with products destined for Mesopotamia and other distant lands. The sophistication of Lothal's infrastructure suggests that maritime trade was not incidental to Indus civilization, but central to its economy and organization. The agricultural base that supported this civilization was impressive. Indus Valley farmers cultivated wheat and barley, the staple grains that fed the urban populations. They also grew rice in some regions, along with dates, melons, and other crops suited to the climate. Domesticated animals included cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, and pigs. The surplus generated by this agricultural system allowed the cities to exist and prosper. Granaries discovered at multiple sites, including Harappa, suggest sophisticated systems for storing grain, protecting it from pests and moisture, and presumably distributing it according to need or labor obligations. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro stands as one of the most evocative structures from this civilization. Measuring roughly 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, with a depth of about 2.5 meters, the bath was built with careful attention to drainage and waterproofing. Steps descend on all sides into the pool. Surrounding chambers suggest changing rooms or spaces for ritual preparation. The construction indicates that bathing held significance in Indus Valley culture, whether for practical hygiene, religious ritual, or both. The fact that such a structure was built at public expense and maintained with care suggests that community bathing was valued, that it held a place in the social and spiritual life of the civilization. Yet for all this sophistication, for all this evidence of organization and planning, the Indus Valley civilization produced no monumental art celebrating gods or rulers. No massive statues proclaimed the power of kings. No temples rose with elaborate decoration. The art that survives consists primarily of small objects, figurines of dancers and animals, seals, beads, and pottery. The figurines are particularly intriguing. A bronze dancing figure, possibly female, suggests artistic sophistication and perhaps indicates the importance of performance or ritual dance in the culture. But these are intimate objects, not public monuments. They tell us about the people's lives and values, but they do not shout about power or hierarchy. The absence of monumental art celebrating rulers or gods is perhaps the most distinctive feature of Indus Valley civilization. In Egypt, pharaohs commissioned massive temples and statues that proclaimed their divine status and eternal power. In Mesopotamia, kings built great palaces and temples that dominated the urban landscape. In the Indus Valley, no such monuments exist. This absence is telling. It suggests a society organized according to different principles, a civilization that did not require the visible assertion of individual power or the glorification of gods through monumental architecture. This does not necessarily mean the Indus Valley was egalitarian. The evidence for craft specialization and organized trade suggests significant economic differentiation. But it does suggest that power, if concentrated, did not express itself through the same mechanisms that other ancient civilizations employed. Between approximately 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization reached its zenith. The cities were thriving. Trade networks extended across vast distances. Populations were growing. The agricultural system was productive. The standardization and organization that characterized the civilization were fully developed. This was the mature Harappan phase at its peak, a time of confidence and stability. The people of the Indus Valley had created something remarkable, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and reach, organized according to principles that remain partially mysterious to us. The origins of this civilization lay in the agricultural surplus and environmental stability of the Indus Valley. The geography that provided water and fertile soil also provided the foundation for complexity. The trading networks that connected distant lands brought wealth and materials that enriched the culture. The commitment to standardization, whether imposed from above or adopted by consensus, created the uniformity that allowed coordination across vast distances. The absence of visible hierarchy created a civilization unlike any other in the ancient world. This was the world that had emerged from the floodplains of the Indus River, a world of order and mystery, of remarkable achievement and puzzling restra, The people who built this civilization had solved problems of urban planning, sanitation, and trade that would challenge later civilizations. Yet they had done so in a manner that left few obvious traces of the individuals who made decisions or the systems that maintained order. The Indus Valley civilization was, from its very origins, a civilization that would puzzle and fascinate those who came after it. The transformation that unfolded across the Indus River basin between roughly 4,500 and 2,600 years before the Common Era stands as one of history's most deliberate civilizational ascendancies. Unlike the sudden consolidations of power seen in contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Harappan civilization emerged through a patient, methodical process of cultural refinement and technological innovation. What had begun as scattered agricultural settlements gradually coalesced into something far more remarkable, a vast network of interconnected cities that would eventually span across an area larger than modern-day Egypt, stretching from the foothills of Afghanistan in the north to the Gujarat coast in the south. The transition from the early Harappan phase, which scholars date to approximately 4,500 years before the present, marked a crucial inflection point. During these formative centuries, the communities inhabiting the fertile floodplains and tributary valleys began experimenting with increasingly sophisticated methods of social organization. Archaeological evidence reveals that populations were growing, settlements were becoming more permanent, and trade was flourishing between neighboring communities. Pottery styles shifted and evolved, reflecting not chaos or conflict, but rather the natural cultural exchange that occurs when communities maintain peaceful contact. The gradual standardization of ceramic forms across vast distances suggests something remarkable was happening. Communities were beginning to share common values and practices. By 2,800 years before the Common Era, the early phases of Harappan culture were giving way to what archaeologists term the mature Harappan period, a designation that captures the full flowering of this civilization's distinctive character. The scale of transformation during these intervening centuries cannot be overstated. What had been a collection of agricultural villages with modest brick structures evolved into fully urbanized centers featuring standardized architecture, integrated water management systems, and evidence of complex administrative coordination. This was not the result of conquest or the imposition of a single ruling authority, which makes it all the more intriguing to contemplate. The most striking feature of Harappan cities was their commitment to order and planning. The streets of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and dozens of other sites were laid out in precise grid patterns, a feature that would not become common in the Mediterranean world until centuries later. These were not organic, winding streets that evolved haphazardly over generations. Rather, they appear to have been planned and executed with remarkable foresight, suggesting that someone or some collective body possessed the authority and vision to organize urban space according to rational principles. The main streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting at right angles with such consistency that modern surveyors have found minimal deviation from perfect perpendicularity. The construction methods employed throughout Harappan cities reveal an equally impressive commitment to standardization. Bricks were manufactured according to a consistent ratio of 4:2:1, their proportions maintained across the entire civilization's extent. Archaeologists have measured thousands of bricks from different sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and found this ratio replicated with remarkable fidelity. Such consistency did not arise by accident. It speaks to either a centralized authority imposing standards or, perhaps more intriguingly, to a shared cultural commitment to uniformity that was so deeply embedded in the civilization's values that it was maintained voluntarily across independent settlements. The implications of this choice deserve contemplation. These people valued consistency, proportion, and order as fundamental goods. The drainage systems that threaded through Harappan cities represent perhaps the most practical expression of this commitment to organized society. Mohenjo-daro, excavated beginning in the 1920s, revealed an intricate network of underground sewers and surface drains that channeled wastewater away from residential areas with impressive efficiency. Terracotta pipes carried water from the celebrated Great Bath, a ritual bathing facility with stairs descending to a carefully maintained pool, into a sophisticated drainage system that prevented stagnation and the accumulation of refuse. The Great Bath itself, measuring approximately 11 meters in length and 7 meters in width, featured waterproofed brickwork and a sophisticated system of outlets. Such public works demanded not merely technical knowledge, but also the collective will to prioritize public health and communal well-being. Water management extended far beyond simple sanitation. At Dholavira, situated on an island in the Great Rann of Kutch in what is now Gujarat, archaeologists have identified an ingenious system of reservoirs and channels that captured seasonal rainfall and stored it for the arid months ahead. This site, with its fortified citadel and vast storage facilities, demonstrates that Harappan engineers understood hydrology and could implement solutions adapted to local environmental conditions. The standardized nature of these technologies, replicated across different climatic zones from the Punjab to the coast, suggests the spread of knowledge and perhaps the movement of skilled craftspeople across the civilization. The question of how such coordination occurred without visible evidence of centralized monarchy or priesthood remains one of the central mysteries of Harappan civilization. Excavations at the major sites have revealed no palaces with the elaborate decoration and size found in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. No royal tombs have emerged from the archaeological record. No monumental statuary celebrating individual rulers, no temple complexes adorned with religious iconography. This absence is not the result of incomplete preservation or unfortunate loss to erosion. Rather, it reflects a fundamental choice about how power and authority were organized within this society. The most prominent structures at Harappan sites were granaries and administrative buildings, suggesting that control over food surplus and trade represented the primary sources of authority. At Harappa itself, a substantial brick structure with multiple storage chambers has been interpreted as a state granary, a facility that would have been crucial for managing surplus during abundant years and distributing provisions during scarcity. Control over the food supply was control over survival itself. Yet these structures, while impressive in their functionality, lack the decorative elaboration or architectural grandeur that typically accompanied royal authority in other ancient civilizations. The Harappans seem to have been uninterested in using architecture as a canvas for displaying individual power or divine right. The seals discovered throughout the Harappan world offer tantalizing glimpses into the civilization's administrative practices and perhaps into the nature of its authority structures. These small objects, typically square or rectangular and fashioned from steatite stone, feature carved images of animals, bulls, rhinoceroses, tigers, and elephants rendered with remarkable naturalism, along with inscriptions in the undeciphered Indus script. Over 3,000 seals have been recovered from archaeological sites, and hundreds more have been found in Mesopotamian contexts, indicating that Harappan merchants or officials were using these seals as tokens of authentication in long-distance trade. The seals likely served as marks of ownership or authority, pressed into clay to validate transactions or to indicate the source of goods. What is most significant about these seals is what they do not depict. Unlike the seals of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Harappan seals bear no images of rulers, no scenes of conquest or domination, no representations of hierarchical relationships. The animal imagery is naturalistic and sometimes almost reverential, suggesting a cultural interest in the natural world that transcended mere utilitarian symbolism. The repeated appearance of the unicorn motif, a horned creature that scholars continue to debate whether it represents a real or mythological animal, suggests shared cultural narratives, yet these narratives were not propagandistic in nature. They do not glorify rulers or celebrate military victories. Instead, they seem to reflect a more abstract set of cultural values. The Indus script itself, comprising approximately 400 unique signs according to current scholarly estimates, remains one of archaeology's most captivating unsolved puzzles. Inscriptions appear on seals, on pottery, on weights and measures, and on various implements, yet no bilingual text has been discovered that might serve as a Rosetta Stone for decipherment. The inscriptions are typically brief, rarely exceeding 10 signs, and seem to cluster around particular semantic fields, words related to trade, perhaps, or administrative designation. Scholars have proposed numerous theories about the script's linguistic foundation. Some argue it represents an early Indo-European language. Others suggest a Dravidian connection. Still others propose entirely unique linguistic structures. The very impossibility of certain decipherment adds to the civilization's mystique. Without, it should be noted, diminishing our ability to understand its material culture and social organization. The trade networks that connected the Harappan world to distant regions represent one of the civilization's most impressive achievements. Harappan seals have been discovered in Mesopotamian sites, particularly in the city of Ur, and in the Sumerian city-states, where they appear in contexts dating to the 23rd and 22nd centuries before the Common Era. Mesopotamian texts from this period reference a land called Meluha, which scholars identify as the Indus Valley region, and describe merchants and trading missions from this distant civilization. The seals themselves, with their foreign script and unfamiliar animal imagery, would have been exotic and intriguing objects to Mesopotamian traders, marking their bearers as representatives of a sophisticated and distant culture. What goods traveled along these trade routes? Mesopotamian records mention lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone prized for its deep blue color, flowing from Afghanistan through the Indus Valley and onward to Mesopotamia. The reverse direction likely carried Mesopotamian textiles, oils, and manufactured goods to the Indus cities. But perhaps more significant than any individual commodity was the exchange of knowledge and technique. Harappan artisans had developed sophisticated methods of working with shell, producing inlays and decorative elements of remarkable delicacy. Indus beads, fashioned from carnelian and other stones with precision and artistry, have been found throughout Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf region. The movement of goods along these routes speaks to the existence of merchant communities, to the development of trust between distant trading partners, and to the existence of a shared understanding of value and exchange. The agricultural foundation that supported these urban centers and far-flung trade networks deserves careful attention. The Indus River, particularly in its lower reaches where the civilization achieved its greatest density, was subject to annual flooding that deposited nutrient-rich silt across the floodplains. This natural cycle of inundation and withdrawal, similar to the Nile's rhythms but less predictable, provided the basis for reliable agriculture. The Harappans cultivated wheat and barley, crops that had been domesticated in the Near East and had spread eastward through cultural contact and the movement of peoples. They also grew cotton, a crop of immense economic importance, particularly as trade networks developed. Cotton cultivation would have been labor-intensive but also highly profitable, especially as textile production became integrated into long-distance trade systems. The environmental context of Harappan civilization's rise was one of relative climatic stability. Paleoclimate evidence derived from sediment cores and other proxy data suggests that the mature Harappan period, roughly 2600 to 1900 years before the Common Era, experienced generally warm and semi-arid conditions punctuated by monsoon rains that were sufficient to support agriculture and maintain river flows. The climate was not dramatically different from conditions today in the same regions, yet subtle variations in rainfall patterns and river behavior would prove consequential over the long term. During the height of Harappan civilization, however, environmental conditions were sufficiently stable to permit the emergence of large urban populations and the accumulation of agricultural surpluses. The crafts practiced throughout the Harappan world speak eloquently to the civilization's technological sophistication and aesthetic sensibility. Pottery was produced in standardized forms using the wheel, a technology that had been invented in Mesopotamia but was rapidly adopted throughout the Harappan realm. The ceramic vessels found at Harappan sites are characterized by their clean lines, their careful proportions, and the restrained nature of their decoration. Geometric patterns predominate, with painted designs of remarkable precision. The impression is one of an aesthetics that valued clarity and functionality over exuberance or ornamentation. This restraint in artistic expression extends to other media as well. Small figurines, many fashioned from terracotta, provide insights into the civilization's spiritual or cultural preoccupations. Female figures with elaborate headdresses and jewelry suggest the importance of women in Harappan society, whether in ritual contexts or as indicators of status. Animal figurines, bulls, birds, and other creatures, are abundant, often rendered with careful attention to anatomical detail. A famous figurine of a dancing girl from Mohenjo-daro, posed with one arm raised and one leg bent, demonstrates that Harappan sculptors could achieve remarkable naturalism and dynamism when depicting human form. Yet such naturalistic representations remain the exception rather than the rule. Most figurines are simple, stylized, and seem to have served practical purposes rather than artistic display. Weights and measures represent another domain in which the Harappan commitment to standardization becomes apparent. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of weights, typically fashioned from stone and calibrated to precise standards. These weights follow a consistent mathematical progression, doubling in value at regular intervals, a system that would have facilitated commercial transactions and prevented fraud. The universal adoption of these standards across the civilization's extent demonstrates the existence of some regulatory mechanism, whether imposed centrally or maintained through shared agreement. A merchant traveling from Harappa to a coastal port could be confident that the weights used to measure goods would be identical to those employed in his home city, a trust that would have been essential for long-distance commerce. The appearance of the Indus Valley civilization at its height, in the centuries around 2,500 years before the Common Era, would have impressed any observer with its orderliness and sophistication. The cities, though smaller than their contemporary counterparts in Egypt or Mesopotamia, were marvels of planning and engineering. The population, estimated at several million across the entire civilization's territory, was distributed across major urban centers and smaller towns in a pattern that suggests careful territorial organization. The absence of monumental architecture devoted to religious or royal purposes created an aesthetic that prioritized the practical and the communal over the grandiose and the individual. This civilization, in its rise and development, had made a fundamental choice about values and priorities. It had chosen order over chaos, standardization over idiosyncrasy, communal welfare over individual aggrandizement. Whether this choice was consciously deliberate or emerged gradually through cultural evolution remains unknowable, yet the results were unmistakable. A vast region of the world, encompassing diverse environmental zones and populations that had not previously been unified, was brought into a single cultural and economic system. Trade flourished, cities grew, agricultural production increased, and knowledge accumulated and spread. The Harappan civilization had achieved something remarkable. A complex, urban society that functioned without the monumental displays of power that characterized other ancient civilizations, suggesting that authority and order could be maintained through mechanisms we are only beginning to understand. The cities of the Indus Valley had reached their zenith. By 2600 years before the Common Era, Mohenjo-daro stood as perhaps the finest urban achievement of its age, rivaling in sophistication and scale any settlement that existed elsewhere on the ancient earth. The streets ran true and perfect. The drainage systems functioned with mechanical precision. The granaries rose like monuments to organized plenty. And yet, beneath this surface of order and accomplishment, subtle tremors of change were already beginning to ripple through the civilization's carefully constructed world. To understand the crisis that would eventually transform and diminish this great civilization, we must first look to the very foundation upon which it was built: the rivers themselves. The Indus River, the Sutlej, the Ravi, and most critically the Ghaggar-Hakra system had provided the lifeblood of Harappan society for generations. These waterways delivered the annual floods that replenished the soil with nutrient-rich sediment, making agriculture not merely possible, but abundantly productive. They provided transportation routes for trade. They supplied fresh water for drinking, bathing, and irrigation. The entire civilization was, in essence, an elaborate human structure built atop a foundation of hydrology. Beginning around 2200 years before the Common Era, evidence from sediment cores and geological surveys reveals that something fundamental began to shift in the climate patterns that had sustained this world. The monsoons, those predictable seasonal winds that brought the rains essential to agriculture across the Indian subcontinent, began to weaken. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather a gradual alteration, a slow diminishment of the moisture-laden winds that had blessed the region with consistent precipitation. Modern paleoclimatic research, drawing on evidence from multiple sources including ice cores, ocean sediments, and terrestrial records, suggests that global climate patterns were shifting during this period, with implications that rippled across multiple ancient civilizations simultaneously. The drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system represents one of the most significant environmental changes affecting the Indus Valley civilization during this period. This river, which had once flowed robustly through the Rajasthan region and the plains of northwestern India, gradually diminished. Some scholars attribute this transformation to tectonic shifts that altered underground aquifers and river channels. Others point to the weakening monsoons as the primary cause, reducing the volume of water feeding the system. The truth likely involves multiple factors working in concert, a complex interplay of climate, geology, and hydrology that no single explanation can fully capture. As the Ghaggar-Hakra weakened, the consequences for human settlement became increasingly apparent. The river valley that had supported numerous Harappan cities and towns, including sites like Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, and Banawali, could no longer sustain the concentrated populations that had flourished there. These settlements had been built on the assumption of reliable water supplies and predictable agricultural yields. When those assumptions began to falter, the entire structure of urban life faced unprecedented stress. Yet the Indus civilization did not collapse suddenly in the manner of a building struck by an earthquake. Instead, evidence from archaeological excavations suggests a more gradual process of transformation and dispersal. The mature Harappan phase, that period of greatest urban development and cultural homogeneity, spanning roughly from 2600 to 1900 years before the Common Era, began to show signs of fragmentation and change as the later period approached. The standardization that had characterized Harappan culture, the identical brick ratios, the uniform weights and measures, the consistent city planning, began to loosen its grip on society. The great cities themselves bore witness to this transition. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeological investigation reveals that the quality of construction in later phases shows subtle but significant decline compared to the earlier periods. Streets were sometimes repaved with less precision. Buildings in some areas appear to have been erected with less attention to the rigid grid patterns that had defined earlier construction. The Great Bath, that marvel of engineering and civic planning, continued to function. Yet the overall maintenance of public infrastructure seemed to become less uniform and less carefully executed. These are not the signs of rapid abandonment, but rather the traces of a civilization in transition, adapting to changing circumstances. The trade networks that had connected the Indus Valley civilization to distant lands also underwent transformation during this period. The extensive commercial relationships that had bound Harappan merchants to traders in Mesopotamia, to the highlands of Afghanistan, and to the coastal regions of the Arabian Peninsula had been fundamental to the civilization's prosperity and cultural identity. Indus seals have been discovered at sites across Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf region, evidence of centuries of sustained commercial contact. Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from the period refer to trade with Meluha, which scholars generally identify as the Indus Valley region, describing exchanges of goods and the presence of Indus merchants in distant ports. However, evidence from both Mesopotamian records and archaeological sites suggests that this extensive trade began to decline and transform around 2200 years before the Common Era. The volume of Indus seals found in Mesopotamian contexts decreases noticeably in later periods. The nature of trade itself appears to have shifted from direct contact between merchants to more indirect exchange networks. Some scholars have proposed that environmental stress and the gradual weakening of centralized authority in the Indus Valley made it increasingly difficult to maintain the organized commercial operations that had characterized the mature Harappan period. The question of political organization becomes particularly significant when considering how the civilization responded to these mounting pressures. The very absence of palaces, temples, and royal iconography that had puzzled and fascinated archaeologists takes on new meaning during this period of crisis. Unlike Egypt with its pharaohs, or Mesopotamia with its city kings, the Indus civilization appears to have lacked the concentrated hierarchical authority that could command rapid, civilization-wide responses to emergencies. Instead, evidence suggests some form of more distributed governance, perhaps councils of merchants and community leaders, perhaps collective decision-making bodies, perhaps a system we lack the vocabulary to accurately describe. This decentralized structure may have been an asset during times of stability and prosperity, allowing for the sophisticated coordination of urban planning and trade without the burden of maintaining an elaborate court or priestly establishment. But when crisis arrived, this same decentralization may have hindered unified response. Individual cities and regions would have faced the challenges of declining water supplies and reduced agricultural productivity somewhat independently, making decisions about resource allocation and population management at the local level, rather than through civilization-wide coordination. The evidence for this period of crisis and adaptation comes from multiple sources that scholars have painstakingly assembled over decades of research. Sediment cores from the Indus River Valley and surrounding regions reveal shifts in soil composition and moisture indicators. The pollen preserved in ancient layers tells stories of changing vegetation patterns as the climate became progressively drier. Archaeological surveys mapping the distribution of settlements show a gradual shift in population centers, with some areas being progressively abandoned while others continued to be inhabited, sometimes at reduced levels of population density and urban sophistication. The script of the Indus Valley, those enigmatic signs that appear on seals and pottery, offers tantalizing hints about this period, though their meaning remains frustratingly obscure. The script consists of roughly 400 unique signs, appearing in short inscriptions that rarely exceed 20 symbols. Despite extensive scholarly effort, the script remains undeciphered, with considerable debate about whether it encodes a spoken language or functions as a system of symbolic representation. What is notable for this period of crisis is that the production of seals bearing the script appears to decline in later phases. This may suggest changes in the commercial and administrative systems that had relied so heavily on these marked objects for identification and authentication of goods. The crafts that had flourished during the height of Harappan civilization also show evidence of transformation. The production of small figurines, the creation of elaborate bead jewelry, the manufacture of standardized weights and measures, all these activities that had characterized Harappan material culture appear to have continued, but with less uniformity and perhaps reduced volume. The artistic achievements of the civilization did not disappear, but they became more variable, less subject to the standardizing impulses that had shaped earlier production. The agricultural foundations of society faced perhaps the most direct and visible stress during this period. The careful irrigation systems that had been constructed to manage water resources and extend cultivation into marginal lands became increasingly difficult to maintain as water supplies diminished. At sites like Dholavira in the Kutch region, evidence of sophisticated water management systems, reservoirs, canals, and distribution networks engineered with considerable sophistication shows signs of being progressively abandoned or allowed to deteriorate. These were not failures of engineering skill, but rather responses to the fundamental reality that the water resources upon which they depended were no longer available in sufficient quantities. The pastoral communities that had existed alongside urban centers during the height of Harappan civilization may have adapted more readily to the changing environmental conditions than the urban populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that as urban centers declined, pastoral and semi-pastoral societies became increasingly prominent in the regions that had once been dominated by Harappan cities. The rigid boundaries between urban and pastoral economies appear to have become more porous, as environmental stress pushed populations toward more mobile, less infrastructure-dependent ways of life. Population movements during this period of crisis created new patterns of settlement across the Indian subcontinent. While some regions experienced decline, others saw an influx of refugees and migrants from areas that could no longer support their populations. Evidence from archaeological surveys suggests that populations gradually shifted eastward and southward, toward regions less affected by the weakening monsoons and the drying of the Indus River system's tributaries. This was not a mass exodus, but rather a gradual drift of human settlement patterns across generations, as communities made incremental decisions about where to plant crops, where to establish seasonal camps, and where to build more permanent settlements. The civilization that had prided itself on standardization and order found itself increasingly unable to maintain the uniform systems that had defined its character. The identical brick ratios that had been observed with remarkable consistency across the civilization began to show more variation. The weights and measures that had facilitated trade and administration showed greater diversity from site to site. These changes are not dramatic. An observer transported from 2500 to 1900 years before the Common Era would still recognize the fundamental continuity of Harappan civilization. But the trajectory was clear. The rigid order was loosening. It is crucial to understand that this period of crisis and transformation did not represent a failure of the Indus civilization in any absolute sense. Rather, it represented an adaptation to new environmental and social realities. The civilization did not collapse into chaos or ruin. Instead, it underwent a gradual metamorphosis, transforming from a largely urban, highly standardized, far-flung network of interconnected cities into a more diffuse, regionally variable pattern of settlements. Some areas maintained recognizable continuity with Harappan culture while incorporating new influences and adapting to local conditions. Other regions were progressively abandoned as human populations sought more sustainable locations. The mystery of this transition, the question of how and why such a sophisticated and successful civilization gradually dispersed and transformed, rather than maintaining its established patterns, continues to fascinate scholars and capture the imagination of those who study ancient human societies. The absence of dramatic evidence, no destroyed cities bearing the marks of invasion, no sudden cessation of cultural activity, no obvious catastrophe, makes this transition both more subtle and in some ways more profound than more dramatic historical transformations. It speaks to the resilience and adaptability of human societies, but also to the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated civilizations when faced with long-term environmental change. As the 19th century, before the Common Era, approached, the great age of the unified Indus Valley civilization was entering its final phase. The cities that had stood as monuments to human organizational achievement would gradually be abandoned or transformed. The trade networks that had stretched across vast distances would become attenuated and eventually disappear. The script that had marked Harappan commerce and administration would fall out of use. Yet the people who inhabited this civilization would not disappear. They would adapt, migrate, and transform, carrying forward elements of Harappan culture while blending with other populations and adopting new ways of life suited to the changing world around them. Between 1900 and 1500 years before the Common Era, something remarkable occurred across the Indus River basin. The great cities did not vanish in a cataclysm. They did not fall to invading armies that left behind charred ruins and shattered monuments. Instead, the civilization transformed. The people dispersed. The urban centers gradually emptied, not all at once, but in phases that stretched across generations. Families packed their possessions and migrated eastward, southward, and into the surrounding regions. The sophisticated world their ancestors had built would eventually fall silent, its streets reclaimed by the river's seasonal floods and the patient encroachment of sand and vegetation. The story of the Indus Valley civilization's decline reveals truths that modern scholars continue to piece together from fragmentary evidence. The collapse, as researchers now understand it, was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather a complex interplay of environmental pressures, economic disruption, and gradual social transformation. the climate itself had begun to shift. Sediment cores extracted from the Arabian Sea tell a story written in layers of ancient dust and pollen. Around 2,200 years before the Common Era, the monsoon rains that had sustained agriculture for thousands of years began to weaken. The patterns that had been reliable for countless generations became erratic. Some years brought sufficient moisture to the floodplains. Other years brought drought. More dramatically still, the rivers themselves were changing course. The Indus River, that great artery that had nourished the civilization from its inception, had always been subject to seasonal flooding and gradual channel migration. But around the time of the civilization's peak, the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which had flowed through the eastern portions of the Indus Valley and supported numerous settlements, began to dry up. This was not a sudden event, but a prolonged process. The evidence comes from satellite imagery and geological surveys that reveal the ancient riverbed, and from archaeological sites that show settlements along this river system gradually being abandoned. The loss of this water source removed the agricultural foundation from communities that had depended upon it for millennia. The great cities responded to these environmental pressures, at least initially, with the resilience that had always characterized their civilization. Mohenjo-daro, despite its location on the main Indus Channel, experienced flooding episodes that required repeated reconstruction of buildings and streets. The standardized bricks that had served so well for centuries continued to be manufactured and laid in perfect geometric patterns. But now the task of maintaining the city became increasingly difficult. In some areas, evidence suggests that people simply abandoned damaged structures rather than rebuilding them. The population began to decline as people sought more reliable sources of water and arable land. What makes this decline so historically significant is not what happened, but how it happened, and what it reveals about the nature of an Indus Valley society. The absence of monumental royal art, palaces, or temples that scholars had observed throughout the civilization's history becomes even more meaningful during this period of stress. There were no desperate attempts to construct grand monuments to appease gods or assert the power of kings. There was no hoarding of resources by an elite class determined to maintain luxury in the face of crisis. Instead, the evidence suggests that the civilization's decentralized, apparently egalitarian structure allowed for a more orderly transition. Communities made pragmatic decisions about migration and resettlement. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated trade for centuries began to disappear from the archaeological record, suggesting that the long-distance trade networks that had connected the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central Asia were gradually dissolving. The trading posts that had flourished in places like Lothal, with its sophisticated dockyard designed to accommodate vessels during tidal changes, saw their commercial activity decline. The seals that had been pressed into clay to mark goods moving along trade routes became less common. Mesopotamian records, which had occasionally mentioned trade with the Indus region, grew silent on the subject. The merchants of the Indus Valley, who had once sent their goods westward to Sumerian cities and received cedar, lapis lazuli, and other exotic materials in return, gradually ceased their long-distance commerce. This was not the result of military conquest or political decision, but rather the natural consequence of a civilization becoming less urbanized and more localized in its economic patterns. Yet the legacy of the Indus Valley civilization did not disappear with the cities. The people themselves did not vanish. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Ganges Valley and other regions to the east reveals settlements established by migrants from the declining Indus centers. The pottery styles, settlement patterns, and cultural practices of these eastern communities show clear connections to the Indus Valley tradition. The knowledge and skills that had allowed the Indus people to build their extraordinary civilization did not simply evaporate. Rather, they were carried eastward and incorporated into the emerging cultures of the Ganges Valley. Agricultural practices, craft techniques, and social organizational principles spread into new regions. The civilization transformed into its successors. Rather than simply ceasing to exist, the undeciphered script of the Indus Valley presents one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. Approximately 400 unique signs have been identified on seals, pottery, and various artifacts. These inscriptions are typically quite short, rarely exceeding 5 or 6 signs. Despite more than a century of scholarly effort, employing methods ranging from traditional linguistic analysis to modern computational approaches, the script remains undeciphered. No bilingual inscriptions have been found, no Rosetta Stone equivalent that might unlock its meaning. This absence of understanding becomes poignant as the civilization fades from the historical record. The very people who created this script, whose thoughts and records it preserved, took its meaning with them as they dispersed to new lands. Scholars continue to debate whether the script encodes a spoken language or functions as a symbolic system of meanings. Some researchers, most notably Ascoparpala, have proposed that the script may represent an early form of a Dravidian language, based on comparative analysis and the distribution of similar linguistic patterns in South India. Others argue that the brevity of the inscriptions and their apparent restriction to seals and markers suggests a system designed for identification and transaction rather than literary expression. The truth remains elusive, preserved in stone and clay, but forever beyond our current ability to read it. This silence is not absence, it is merely a different kind of presence, a reminder that civilizations can achieve remarkable sophistication while leaving mysteries that later generations cannot fully solve. The material culture of the late Indus period shows clear patterns of simplification and localization. The elaborate seals that had been created with such artistry, featuring carefully rendered images of animals, unicorns, bulls, tigers, and rhinoceroses, gradually disappeared from production. The standardized weights that had served commercial transactions with mathematical precision became less common. The small terracotta figurines that had been crafted in consistent styles gave way to more varied, locally distinctive forms. This was not evidence of cultural decline in the moral sense. Rather, it reflected a shift in social priorities. The mechanisms that had maintained cultural uniformity across vast distances, the long-distance trade networks, the regular exchange of goods and ideas between distant cities, were weakening. Communities became more self-sufficient and more distinctive in their local traditions. The great citadels that had stood in major cities were gradually abandoned. At Mohenjo-daro, the upper city, with its fortified walls and the famous Great Bath, which had served purposes still debated by scholars, eventually fell into disrepair. The carefully maintained drainage systems, which had represented one of the civilization's greatest achievements, were no longer maintained with the same precision. Water began to accumulate in places where it had once been carefully managed. The streets that had been swept clean and maintained with almost obsessive care became less orderly. This transformation did not happen suddenly, but was rather a gradual loosening of the standards and practices that had defined urban life for centuries. Yet even as the cities declined, the achievements of the Indus Valley civilization endured in the consciousness of later peoples. The Vedic texts, composed by Indo-Aryan peoples who migrated into the subcontinent around 1500 years before the Common Era, contain references to cities and peoples that may well reflect memories of the Indus civilization. The Sanskrit term pura, meaning city, and pur, meaning fort, may derive from encounters with the fortified settlements of the Indus Valley. The later Hindu tradition, which would develop over subsequent centuries and millennia, may have incorporated elements of Indus Valley religious practice and cosmology, though the mechanisms of this transmission remain obscure. The environmental recovery of the Indus Valley Basin proceeded at nature's own pace. The dried river channels remained as ghost waterways, their courses visible from above but no longer carrying the life-giving flow of water. The forests that had once covered the region became more sparse as the climate continued its shift toward greater aridity. The wildlife that had been depicted so carefully on the seals, the rhinoceroses, the tigers, the water buffalo, gradually disappeared from the region as their habitats changed. The elephant, which had been present in the Indus Valley during the civilization's height, became increasingly rare in the northwest as the climate became less favorable to its survival. Thousands of years would pass before these regions would experience significant human settlement again. When new civilizations eventually arose in the Indus Valley, they would be fundamentally different from what had come before. The memory of the great cities faded. The script was forgotten. The knowledge of who had built these structures and why gradually dissolved into legend and myth. The ruins themselves became buried under meters of silt and sand deposited by the river's continuing cycles of flood and flow. Farmers worked fields above these buried cities without knowing what lay beneath their plows. It was not until the 19th century of the Common Era, nearly 40 centuries after the civilization's decline, that the Indus Valley civilization would be rediscovered. British archaeologists and engineers, working on railroad construction and irrigation projects, began to notice unusual artifacts and structures. In 1875, the discovery of a seal bearing an undeciphered script sparked curiosity among scholars. Systematic excavations beginning in the 1920s at sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa revealed the astonishing sophistication of this long-forgotten civilization. The world learned that an advanced urban culture had flourished in the Indus Valley at the same time that the Egyptian pyramids were being built, and the great Babylonian kingdoms were reaching their height. The rediscovery transformed our understanding of human civilization. Here was evidence of a vast, interconnected society spanning more than 1,500 kilometers from north to south. Here were cities planned with a precision that suggested centralized authority, or at least widespread agreement on standards and practices. Here was evidence of international trade spanning thousands of kilometers. Yet here also was an absence: no royal palaces, no monumental temples, no hierarchical art glorifying kings or priests. This absence was as significant as the presence of the cities themselves, suggesting a fundamentally different model of social organization than the hierarchical kingdoms that dominated the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. The legacy of the Indus Valley civilization extends far beyond its historical importance. The very existence of this civilization challenges assumptions about how human societies must be organized to achieve sophistication and scale. The civilization proves that monumental architecture dedicated to individual rulers, elaborate royal iconography, and priestly hierarchies are not prerequisites for urban development, technological innovation, or long-distance trade. The standardized system of weights and measures, which appears to have been maintained across the entire civilization, suggests that coordination and regulation could be achieved through mechanisms other than centralized bureaucratic control. The careful city planning and public infrastructure point to collective decision-making and shared investment in common goods. The undeciphered script remains a humbling reminder of the limits of archaeological knowledge. Despite all the tools of modern science, satellite imagery, chemical analysis, computational linguistics, there are still mysteries that resist solution. The thoughts, laws, poetry, and knowledge recorded in the Indus script remain forever inaccessible to us. This is not a failure of scholarship, but rather a recognition that some knowledge is irretrievably lost when the context for interpretation disappears. The script serves as a monument to human achievement and to human limitation simultaneously, representing both the sophistication of Indus Valley civilization and the inevitable fragmentariness of our understanding of the past. The climate changes that contributed to the civilization's decline offer lessons for the present age. The Indus Valley civilization had flourished during a period of relatively stable climate, with monsoon rains that were generally reliable and rivers that flowed with sufficient consistency to support large populations. When that climate stability was disrupted, when the monsoon weakened and rivers changed course, the civilization could not adapt quickly enough. The agricultural base that had supported cities of thousands of people could no longer be sustained. The complex economic systems that depended on reliable harvests and water availability began to fail. The civilization did not collapse catastrophically, but it could not maintain its urban centers in the face of sustained environmental pressure. The gradual abandonment of the Indus Valley cities between 1900 and 1500 years before the Common Era marks not an ending, but a transformation. The people who had created this civilization did not disappear. They migrated, dispersed, and contributed to the cultures that would emerge in new lands. The knowledge they possessed of urban planning, of water management, of craft production, of trade and commerce, was not lost, but was carried forward into new contexts. The civilizations that would emerge in the Ganges Valley and other regions would bear traces of Indus Valley influence, even if those traces would eventually become obscured and difficult to recognize. Today, the archaeological remains of the Indus Valley civilization lie scattered across the landscape of Pakistan and northwestern India. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro, threatened by rising water tables and modern development, remain among the world's most important archaeological sites. The planned streets, the sophisticated drainage systems, the Great Bath, and the countless small artifacts recovered from these cities continue to reveal new information about a civilization that flourished 5,000 years ago. Each excavation, each analysis of pottery or seal or artifact adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how the Indus people lived, worked, and thought. The civilization that left no kings left, instead a legacy of questions and inspirations. It demonstrated that sophisticated urban civilization could emerge and flourish without the hierarchical structures that seemed inevitable to later observers. It created a writing system that remains mysterious and intriguing. It built cities of such order and precision that they continue to astound modern observers. It participated in far-flung trade networks that connected it to distant lands. And when environmental pressures made the continuation of urban life impossible, it responded not with desperate grandeur, but with pragmatic adaptation and migration. The Indus Valley civilization ultimately teaches us that human history contains multitudes of possibilities. Societies can organize themselves in different ways. Power can be distributed differently. Values can emphasize different aspects of human achievement. The absence of monumental royal art does not indicate the absence of sophisticated culture. The lack of grand temples does not suggest the absence of spiritual life. The civilization's choice, whether deliberate or gradual, to remain relatively egalitarian and to emphasize practical achievements over symbolic displays of authority, represents one path that human civilization could take. That this path was abandoned not through conquest or internal collapse, but through the inexorable pressure of environmental change, reminds us of the deep connections between human societies and the natural world that sustains them. As we look back across the millennia to the cities of the Indus Valley, we are looking at a civilization that achieved remarkable things, that created beautiful objects, that organized itself with care and precision, and that ultimately proved vulnerable to forces beyond its control. The people who built Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, who created the seals and figurines that have survived to our time, who maintained trade routes stretching across vast distances, are long gone. Their language remains unspoken. Their script remains unread. Yet their achievement endures, preserved in stone and brick, in the careful arrangements of streets and buildings, in the artifacts that museums around the world now hold as treasures of human history. The civilization that left no kings left, instead a legacy of mystery, sophistication, and enduring human ingenuity.